Hello and welcome to our second CAHRS webcast for 2021. My name is Brad Bell. I'm the William J. Conity Professor of Strategic Human Resources, and I also serve as the Academic Director of the Center for Advanced Human Resource Studies in ILR School. Today I'm joined by two of my colleagues, John Hausknecht and Tony Byers, who will be sharing some of their recent work focused on diversity and inclusion analytics. A little background about John and Tony. John's a professor of HR studies in the ILR School. His research, teaching, and consulting focuses on HR analytics and staffing related topics such as employee selection and turnover. Tony is Diversity and Inclusion Programs Director and Senior Extension Faculty in the ILR School. He is an author and D&I expert who has experience leading D&I efforts for companies such as Starbucks, Cargill, and H.J. Heinz. A recent CAHRS survey that we just put out showed that DE&I is one of the top issues on the HR agenda heading into this new year, which is really not surprising given all that we saw around social and racial injustice over the past year. As companies look to build capability in this space and evolve their DE&I agenda, it's critical to better understand what is and is not working. This is where D&I analytics can play a critical role. In the latter part of last year, John and Tony ran a CAHRS working group focused on this topic, and they'll be doing another one coming up in May. In the meantime, I thought I would get them together just to share some of the insights that they've gleaned from their work thus far, and also to better understand some of the agendas, some of the items that they see on the future agenda in this space. To give you a little background on what we'll be doing over the next 30 minutes or so, I'm going to start out by just asking John and Tony a few questions to, again, better understand some of the insights that have come from their work. During this discussion, I encourage you to please share your own questions and comments, either in the chat or in the Q&A function here in Zoom. And we'll leave some time at the end of today's session to field some of your questions. So with that, I'll direct the first question here to Tony. Tony, what do you see as the potential value or promise of diversity inclusion analytics, and how would you characterize the current state of D&I analytics in companies today?
Thank you, Brad. I appreciate the opportunity to join you here. And it's an interesting question. I was actually thinking about that as I was listening to you read it. The value or the promise of D&I analytics for this point is to be able to demonstrate success with diversity and inclusion initiatives, however an organization might define that success. But what's interesting about this, there is the promise that diversity brings, meaning there's a strong correlation to business success. But the big part of this is if, and I'm going to put that in air quotes, there's a strong correlation to success inside of a business if D&I efforts are done well. You will then see increases in employee engagement or team productivity or the creation of ideas, innovation ideas. You might even see products go to market or increase in sales performance. But if you're not doing it well, you're not going to get to those points. So where organizations have to struggle is trying to find out or figure out what's meaningful or beneficial for them in relationship to diversity and inclusion, and then try to understand how to measure it. So in your perspective or in your opening, you said there's a growing importance in trying to measure the effectiveness or create some metrics around diversity and inclusion. I think some of the problems when you think about current state is that it's really disparate by organization. There's kind of no quick alignment or chart that we can go through that says that all organizations should think about measuring diversity this way and look for these outcomes, because it's so dependent on the maturity of the organization in terms of their DE&I efforts. So organizations that are at the beginning have different measures and metrics than organizations that are at the end. But they're all trying to do one thing, and that is to just demonstrate effectiveness. Until we get to that point of understanding what's required for that organization, it's going to be hard or challenging for them to be able to demonstrate their effectiveness around this space. And looking at another organization who's been doing D&I work for 20 years and you've been doing it for 5 years is not the most effective way to measure or to try to assess whether or not you are making progress. I really think that gets a number of organizations in trouble when they think about identifying success in this space.
So just a quick follow-up, because I think that's a really interesting point that you have companies that are at different levels of maturity, and given that they're going to have different metrics, and therefore kind of this benchmarking against other companies is potentially flawed or misguided. So given that, I mean, how do you recommend that companies examine their analytics? Is it in the sense of, are we getting better over time, or is there some other kind of way to assess how they're doing relative to those metrics?
Yeah, for me, when I work with organizations, I look for better over time, or what I try to highlight is meaningful progress. Show me what meaningful progress looks like year over year, as opposed to having this stake in the ground that say this is what the end goal looks like in terms of success for D&I for us. You might have, and many people have heard the comments that DE&I is a journey, not a destination. Well, when you work with organizations that focus on this as a destination, what they're clear about is once I hit a particular point, we must be done. And that is not the case, because it's always evolving. We're always changing. Society and culture has taught us a lot that we need to keep evolving these practices. So what I like for an organization to focus on is an evolutionary process where they're continually learning, continually growing, and to continue to make progress towards a better organization. And you can demonstrate that by your metrics, but you need to be able to show the metrics trending in the right line over time. And how you share that message is going to depend on what you want to work on and what's important for you. So how do you assess yourself and try to determine what do we need to work on, not what does company Brad or company John needs to work towards?
So just one more follow-up for you, Tony. A question that just came in from one of the attendees that's relative to this discussion. Question is, is there criteria to determine the level of DE&I maturity that an organization has? So how do you know where you are along that continuum that you laid out?
Yeah. So there is a general, I'm going to use the word framework, that organizations try to look at in terms of categories. And you might have heard this to whoever the person who raised that question. And there's 3 categories, but I'm going to now mention a 4th category that's becoming much more popular. So there's the workforce, right? And that's an analysis of our workforce. And this begins to think about everything from retention to representation at various levels of the organization. And there are a lot of data points in between. Then there is the workplace. That would be the 2nd category, where we start to talk about what the culture of the environment looks like. We start to think about how the culture or how the environment is actually creating a place where all individuals can be successful, including individuals who identify from some of these underrepresented groups or diverse backgrounds. And then there's the marketplace, which is the harder one to measure. And this one really talks about what is it that we do to leverage the diversity and equity and inclusion that we've created in our organization, and how does that help us be successful when we go to market, whether it's a product or a service that we provide to our end user. Now, the latest thing that we're really starting to see and understand is that there's probably a new category that's coming up that will create new levels of metrics for us. And this is this notion about what we consider to be what's our social impact. We see social impact in terms of CSR ratings. When, if a company makes a product that they look at waste or use or those kind of things. We're also starting to see social impact now in terms of diversity and inclusion. And some examples of what that could mean is, what's our engagement, volunteer engagement in diverse communities? Maybe there's contributions to diverse communities or social organizations. You're starting to see our organizations create scholarships for underrepresented groups or create programming for underrepresented groups. And what they're trying to do at that point in time is demonstrate that their social impact to the community is one that is pointing to them as being a good corporate citizen, or one that is living the values of diversity and inclusion versus just talking about it.
Great, thanks, Tony. And we just had another question come in, and I think this is a good transition to what I was going to ask you about, John. The question is, how do you measure the effectiveness of diversity inclusion programs? And I know we've been tracking demographic data for a long time, looking at representation, but obviously that's only provides us kind of part of the picture. So what are some of the other approaches that you're seeing companies use to complement this kind of demographic representation data?
Sure. So thanks for having me here today. I'm glad to be here. So, one of the things we heard in the working groups is that just about every company is doing the demographic representation tracking that Tony mentioned just a minute ago. And that's been around for a number of years, right? And it's not just for the organization as a whole, but also various breakdowns by geography, job level, and so forth. So that's been kind of a classic approach to tracking D&I efforts. But what we're seeing and hearing from a lot of companies is what Tony talked about. So we have the workforce. Now, what about the workplace? How do we get at metrics and analytics that help us understand where we have pockets of opportunity and where we're making progress? And so we heard of three basic approaches. The first, none of these will be surprises, but it is kind of a new application of some of these tools. So surveys be one of the most common, whether it's internal surveys or using an external organization or partner to help with that, really to get at the inclusion dimensions. And so some companies were using, short couple 3 to 5 item indexes. Others had more detailed surveys, but the kind of common denominator is that they're getting at some of those workplace characteristics that indicate whether these efforts are, to attract and retain diverse populations or diverse workforce are actually, whether that's being felt on the front line. So I'd say surveys is kind of one big bucket. The second that we heard a lot about is what I kind of call focus groups or more qualitative data. And that's almost as a complement to the quantitative surveys. So you have kind of numerical indices about inclusion, but what does that actually look like and feel like in the words of employees themselves? So a lot of companies are starting to think about how they capture that data, not so much as systematically as the surveys, but at least informally or in pockets of opportunity. And then the last one we heard about was sort of crowdsourced data. And that comes from either web-based context where maybe they have an all-employee meeting and they can talk about DE&I issues, and in the process gather some good input from employees about changes they might like to see or issues that they're facing in their day-to-day work. So kind of those three key pieces: surveys, focus groups, and crowdsourcing were some of the current ways of getting at data that moves beyond just demographic representation.
That's great, John. So the question came in, basically asking, are there ways to proactively measure, potential discrimination? So kind of thinking about the application of analytics in this space, maybe in a more predictive fashion, right? Are you seeing any of that, or is it still in the more kind of retrospective, type of examination?
Yeah, I mean, I can take a first, crack at that, and Tony, feel free to add. But I think definitely in the selection assessment space, it's really a good opportunity for companies to explore different tools, test them out maybe with current employees before they roll them out with applicants, and look for patterns of bias. Maybe they're replicating bias that they've already had in the organization through the questions they're asking or the tools that they're using. So it is a way that you can kind of be a little bit more proactive and predictive in the sense that you're trying to identify tools that are both effective in identifying high performers and a good fit for the job, but also tools that, if you want to call it legally compliant, but more so than that, help diversify the workforce. So I think you are starting to see that, especially in the algorithms assessment space, and potentially other areas of HR, but definitely in that area.
Yeah, John, I think I would just add, for whoever made that question, I would hope that they see a decline in the number of complaints of discrimination inside of your organization would be a great indicator that you're making progress towards that. I mean, any organization that is experiencing accusations or allegations of discrimination, there should be concern, and looking at those areas in which John pointed to becomes important. I think where this becomes vitally important is learning to look at the processes that we created for our organization and institution through the lens of inclusion or through the lens of equity, and have we unintentionally created barriers that are not necessarily related to essential functions of a job to identify what talent is like. or what talent needs to have in order to be successful or a leader inside of our organization. And so just learning to look through that lens is one of the things in which you can utilize or practice to ensure that you're creating an environment or an opportunity that is fair and equitable to everyone. The outcome of that, though, is looking at your organization and you can see, where there are barriers. If I'm looking at my job and I have 100 people in this job function and only one person who identified as an underrepresented minority, that's an indication that I might want to look just to make sure that I don't have any policies that could be inadvertently leaving people out. In particular, if my organization has more than one underrepresented person within it. So there are some common sense things, and then there are some practical things that we can do.
So Tony, a question that relates to something you just said about, having this person that, identifies as, a member of a particular group. One of the questions that came in is, given the sensitivity of this data, how are companies encouraging employees to self-identify on disability or sexual orientation or ethnicity or race or any of these things so that you actually have the data to work with within these companies?
Yeah. See, that is one of the questions in terms that create the biggest challenge is that if you have a culture inside of your organization where people are clear about why you're asking these questions, or it's a learning culture, or it's these things in which people are used to the organization operating and thinking and assessing themselves on their progress around diversity and inclusion, you have a tendency to see greater levels of participation. But if I'm a new organization, I'm organization Tony, and I look at organization Brad, and you've been doing this for 20 years, and one of the things that you do is you've got a great self-ID report out process, and I say, I want to do that. If I'm starting there without having leaders informed and leaders talking about it and trying to encourage people to do it and talk about the importance of it, not having it talked about it from the top of the leadership house, as well as having it discussed from frontline managers. And when I was inside of organizations, what we would do was train the people managers to share with their team why this is important, to mention this, talk about what we're trying to do, discuss this. So it really is building a culture of trust that is required in order to capture that data. And it's going to be more than just saying, here's what everybody else is doing and we should do this too.
So John, a question came in that relates to some of your comments around the kind of selection issues. The person's raising this issue of, we start with a diverse funnel, but maybe don't end up with a diverse slate all the time because recruiters or those in charge of the selection process might not, again, have access to all of this kind of EEO data or representation data. So any kind of best practices or ideas on, how companies can ensure that they really get these kind of diverse slates in the selection or recruitment process?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's something we're still learning more about, but the fact that you might be able to segment the recruitment process or the funnel and identify those stages at which you're seeing significant drop off might point you to digging a little bit deeper, right? So I know some companies have tried to survey applicants to understand why, we get you to the point of offer, but then our offer acceptance rates are wildly different between particular groups. So that's again where some companies have gone the focus group route and just tried to understand what's kind of holding up their progress as they recruit a diverse funnel, but then it comes to their actual hires and they're not seeing that same follow through. Tony, I don't know if you have additional thoughts on that, but I think it's definitely
I have a more perplexing question. I don't know if it's an answer, but it's this notion of how do you even know then that you have a diverse funnel, right? And so you're saying, well, I don't really know what my talent looks like by the time we get to the selection. I'm not the person who picked these people. Well, then how do you know the funnel is even diverse from the beginning? And so if that's the case, then we do have a sense that we're attracting people to apply for particular roles, and then it seems like the acceptance or the making it to diverse slates or the actual making it to hire seems to be the problem or challenge, if you will. And so that's where we try to spend some time and some focus by looking at the lens to ensure that we have not created any what we call functions necessary to do the job. We're making sure that we balance between essential and what's nice to have. Right? A person should have 10 years. This person has 9. Okay, they can't make it. They're automatically kicked out. Well, how do we determine, the difference between 9 and 10? And so we really got to be clear about that. And then you see a lot of organizations trying to implement bias training or bias in talent selection or bias in reading resumes with the hope that it will start to influence the individuals who are selecting the final candidates for a job role to ensure that they have at least one or maybe multiple individuals who identify underrepresented groups. In some organizations, you see great success in that, and others is still kind of flat in terms of, is bias training going to be enough? And so what I would want to know is, how do we look at whatever the job category you're hiring for, if you happen to have a lot of diversity in job category A and less in job category B, I want you to actually focus on job category B. And I want you to get really specific in terms of what the criteria needs to be and really help people understand and expand their reach to identify talented individuals from all groups who can apply for those particular positions, so that we want to see an increase in the number of underrepresented groups who are in the final candidate slate. And it requires a little bit of work. You can't just source your way out and say, we put the job out and we I even put it out on different sites. You probably are going to have to become a little bit more active in terms of identifying talent.
So an interesting question that came in kind of goes to the reporting side of this, right? Looking at these different measures that we've talked about, and the question specifically highlights the recent example of Netflix releasing their inclusion report and kind of asking, is this kind of a step in the right direction? Are we likely to see more companies kind of being more transparent about sharing their D&I analytics data, broadly? What do you, John or Tony, any thoughts on that?
I appreciate the intent of it. I think the details and the interpretation of some of that is where things get a bit tricky. And I'll just give a simple example. If you have an organization that has maybe a large retail presence or population, hundreds of stores, and then you have a similar industry company that doesn't have that same kind of lower wage retail customer facing population, and then you try to compare the two on this public report or these kind of standardized metrics. On the surface, the interpretations might make sense, right? This group seems to be doing much better than this group. The details of it, though, when you think about, and Tony alluded to this, different job groups and different geographic regions, different everything for companies, right? It invites this kind of simple comparison or simplistic, naive comparison maybe between companies just based on single metrics. And so I think that's the caution. But the intent to me is great. And I like the idea of inclusion metrics, maybe more so than demographic representation, because there you might have a little bit more standardization and be able to say, look, our employees feel welcome here. We ask the same questions in this company, a little bit less so, right? You still have those same interpretational issues, but it would seem like that would make a little bit more sense in terms of trying to publicly share how you're doing in those areas. Not to say demographic, sharing demographic representation isn't also potentially helpful, but I just think it's a trickier area.
And someone, I was just going to kind of build on that, Tony, and maybe, question came in terms of, how do you tell the kind of full story of progress, over time that we've talked about, right? And I think it goes to John's point, if you're just putting out a report, it might not be providing the full picture of what's going on or the factors that are influencing a D&I in your organization. So whether you're doing this internally or externally, how do you kind of lay out that story or show that, progress over time?
Yeah, so I think what organizations are trying to do is they're trying to demonstrate what they're calling transparency, with the hopes that this will increase levels of accountability. And for me, when we start sharing that kind of data, one of the things that I look for is more leadership diversity than I look for employee-based diversity, because to John's point, we have seen organizations that are large scales, global or national, where they've had 51% diversity, but when you got above kind of the entry level or regional manager level, that percentage of diversity went down from 51% down to the teens. And so, how do you demonstrate that there is this diversity up and down the organization? And also, we're starting to see a lot of new businesses start up trying to capture the employees' perception of inclusion and engagement now. There's a new organization that started up that's trying to assess organizations based on how employees are identifying or telling their story about what it feels like to be in this organization. There was even a little article today in the Washington Post that was outlining about young people and their perspective of diversity and inclusion inside of an organization, and how they're making decisions to either join an organization or not join an organization based on the experience of, do they have diversity inclusion initiatives? Are they talking about it? Are they open to it? But inside of that article, another business is saying, we're trying to capture how employees are identifying what it's like to work for Company John or Company Tony. And I think that also will be instructive to us. What do you look like? And then how employees engage. And for me, it's what does the leadership look like? And then how employees are engaged.
So, interesting question that just came in is around kind of setting goals, right? This person's kind of highlighting our organization sets kind of really aspirational demographic, representation goals, but that also creates some frustration because people may see them as too aspirational or too difficult to achieve. So I guess, how do you push for progress and advancement, but at the same time do so in a way that seems achievable within your organization?
One thing we heard in the working groups that was pretty clear is that for large multinational companies with a global presence that are trying to have aspirational goals that cut across all regions, it is really challenging, right? I mean, if you think locally, just the variation you have in different business units, geographies, et cetera, makes it very difficult to have a single standard. And so I think at the same time, signifying that you have goals and that you're aiming towards some, target or progress is a good sign. I think what we're hearing in the focus group or in the working groups is that helps to an extent, but then it does come down to kind of locally, where are you? And to what Tony said earlier, how are you improving over time? So you may be very far from the aspirational goal right now, but what kind of progress are you making year over year, quarter over quarter? So maybe I'll pause there, and Tony, see if you have anything.
Yeah, it's the roadmap. And so the companies that I've been working with, they have posted these aspirational goals, whether I agree or not. But what we help them see is that, and we call it aspirational. We say, here is our aspirational goal versus this is the goal. And then we say, and here are the steps that are going to get us there, so that people can at least track and follow and see where we're at. And so if it's a 5-year goal, because we got our 2025 commitments, here we are in our aspirational goal, and here are the things that you will see to help, the things that you will know to help us determine that we are making progress toward that goal. So you got to really create those roadmap steps or mile markers underneath the goal for people to understand where you're at.
So I know we're running up on time. We have a lot of questions, but I'll try to hit a couple more just real quickly here before we wrap up. So we talked about, again, this maturity model, and what you measure really depends on where you're at in that level of maturity. The question here is, a person that's coming into role, an organization that's had relatively little D&I efforts over time, and it's just kind of starting, sounds like pretty low on that maturity model. Where should they focus? What should they measure if they're really just kind of getting started?
The focus, and so what I would probably do, it's a great question and challenging one to answer at the same time, because I don't know the background about the organization. Is the only reason why I take a deep breath, so that I make sure I give you something that's useful. So think about it in the 3 or 4 primary categories first. Right? What's our workforce? What do we talk about in the workplace? and then what's marketplace. And then if you want, you can also talk about that social dimension. So you just take a broad look of where you're at right now, and then you're able to identify where there are areas of opportunities for us to tweak or enhance. And that's probably where I would tell you to start. And if you look at those 3 to 4 categories, you will be aligned with what most organizations are doing. I just would hate for somebody to say, I'm just going to look at what company X is doing and then go right after it. I think you should really just look at where you're at, but you've got categories to think about it.
So one other question here talks about, measuring inclusion. It kind of gets to your workplace
Yeah.
piece, Tony.
Yeah.
Either you or John, do you see kind of standard indices, measures of inclusion that organizations are using, or organizations really kind of developing these, on their own to really kind of fit their own context?
Yeah, I could just give an overview of what I've been seeing. Really a wide range. I mean, I don't think there's any standardized tool that everyone agrees is the best way to measure inclusion. Of course, to Tony's points earlier, it may have a slightly nuanced or different meaning in your particular context. So I think that does invite more of a custom approach. But there are some core themes that come through in measures of inclusion. The idea of belongingness, the idea of being able to retain your sense of uniqueness while feeling included. Feeling like you're an insider in the group is kind of another theme we see in a lot of the survey questions. The academic literature, I've just seen a handful of different scales come out that have been validated that sort of get at some of these concepts. And then of course, I'm sure there are a plethora of survey firms that have their own kind of custom tool or standardized tools, but definitely a wide range, but not very large, a handful of items, 10 items, 12 items, not really extensive surveys from the ones that I've seen.
Yeah, I agree. Just to add to this real quickly, the another big indicator is safety, and how people feel safe to give feedback inside of an organization, or how comfortable people feel providing information that is contradictory to what the leadership is talking about, which is also part of that safety notion. And so really getting an understanding of what it's like and ensuring that all individuals feel safe. Oh, and let me just add that we need to also look at the data based on different demographic groups. And so you're going to have to segment this data. And I know a lot of people don't like doing that, but if you have voices of an underrepresented population and there are 2 or 3 trying to say that I have an issue here when 100 feel great, it is easy to miss the perspective of the 2 to 3. So you got to segment the data so that you can get a picture of how each group is feeling about inclusion inside of your environment. And then last, I would say, and depending on who your survey administrator, who they are, you have an opportunity to create what is called an inclusion index. Just like you have a management category or a communication category, you can have an inclusion index category that give you a sense of inclusion, and it will create for you favorability rating and average rating. And you can then look at job functions to see if are they at average for favorability. And those that are not, you develop a plan, and those that are, you talk about how you improve.
Well, Tony, John, I want to thank you. This has been a great discussion. Lots of questions. I'm sorry we couldn't get to all of them. We're already, over time. I want to be mindful of time. Please do join us for additional CAHRS webcasts and working groups. Again, thanks to Tony and John for sharing their insights and expertise with us today. And thanks for all of you for joining us. Take care.